August 1st, 1943. Ploești, Romania. The production supervisor at the Astra Română refinery stood frozen at his observation platform, watching columns of black smoke rise from what had been the Reich's most vital fuel source just hours before. His logbook entry, later discovered by Soviet forces, read simply, "The Americans have found our heart, and they know how to stop it from beating." In the span of a single summer day, 177 B-24 Liberator bombers flying at treetop level had done what 2 years of strategic bombing couldn't achieve. They had begun the systematic destruction of Hitler's oil empire, the invisible lifeblood that kept every tank rolling, every aircraft flying, every ship moving. What the Germans didn't realize as they fought fires and counted casualties was that this raid marked the beginning of a campaign that would strangle the Third Reich more effectively than any army on the ground. Throughout the spring and summer of 1943, German military commanders across occupied Europe began reporting a disturbing pattern that defied explanation. The symptoms appeared first at the front lines, then spread backward through the entire Wehrmacht logistics network like a creeping paralysis. General-Major Walther Neering, commanding the 24th Panzer Corps in southern Russia, sent increasingly frustrated dispatches to Army Group South headquarters. His Tiger tanks, the most powerful armored vehicles on the Eastern Front, sat immobilized in maintenance depots, not from battle damage or mechanical failure, but from empty fuel tanks. In May 1943, his corps received 2,400 tons of fuel, 60% of the allocated amount. By June, deliveries dropped to 1,800 tons, barely 45% of requirements. Nering's handwritten notes, later captured by Soviet forces, revealed his bewilderment. "The quartermaster assures me refineries operate at full capacity. Transportation routes remain secure, yet my panzers cannot move. Where does the fuel go?" 600 miles to the west, Luftwaffe fighter ace Oberst Johannes Steinhoff faced a different manifestation of the same crisis. His Jagdgeschwader 77, equipped with the new Focke-Wulf FW-190 fighters, received orders to intercept American bomber formations striking industrial targets in Bavaria. The pilots were ready, the aircraft mechanically sound, but fuel trucks arrived at the airfield half empty. Steinhoff's squadron flew 1 sortie instead of 3 that day. 12 fighters took off when 36 should have scrambled. The American bombers reached their targets with minimal fighter opposition. Steinhoff's after-action report, preserved in Luftwaffe archives, noted bitterly, "We possess superior aircraft and experienced pilots. Both are useless without fuel to reach operational altitude." In the Atlantic, Korvettenkapitän Heinrich Lehmann Willenbrock, commanding U-boat 256, experienced the crisis firsthand in a way that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Operating from the massive concrete U-boat pens at Saint-Nazaire, France, his submarine hunted Allied convoys in the mid-Atlantic. Successful patrols required staying at sea for 6 to 8 weeks, running on diesel while surfaced and electric motors while submerged. In July 1943, Lehmann Willenbrock returned from patrol after only 3 weeks. His diesel bunkers weren't empty, they were half full. But orders from BDU, U-Boat Command, were explicit: return to port immediately. Current fuel insufficient for extended operations. The captain's war diary, recovered after France's liberation, recorded his confusion. In 2 years of war patrols, never have I been recalled for fuel conservation. Something fundamental has changed. At the Reich Chancellery in Berlin, the statistical reports crossing Reichsminister Albert Speer's desk painted an increasingly dire picture that contradicted official production figures. Speer, Hitler's Minister of Armaments and War Production, possessed perhaps the most comprehensive understanding of Germany's industrial capacity. His Economic Analysis Division, led by Dr. Friedrich Luschen, compiled data from every sector of the war economy. The fuel reports made no sense. According to official statistics, Germany's monthly fuel production exceeded 1.6 million tons, barely below the Wehrmacht's consumption rate of 1.8 million tons. A deficit of 200,000 tons should be manageable, covered by strategic reserves. Yet frontline units reported fuel shortages everywhere simultaneously. Luschen's analysis, preserved in Speer Ministry archives, concluded production figures appear accurate. Storage facility inventories show adequate reserves. Distribution networks function normally. Yet military units receive 50 to 60% of allocated fuel. The discrepancy suggests either catastrophic system loss or deliberately falsified production data. Neither explanation satisfied Speer. System loss, fuel loss to accidents, theft, or transportation inefficiency rarely exceeded 8 to 10% of production. The current shortfall implied 30 to 40% losses, impossible without massive infrastructure failure. Falsified production data would require conspiracy across dozens of facilities and hundreds of administrators. There was a third possibility that Speer's team hadn't yet considered. Germany's fuel supply wasn't merely inadequate, it was actively being destroyed faster than it could be replaced. The mystery deepened with reports from General Oberst Alfred Jodl, chief of the operations staff at Oberkommando der Wehrmacht. Jodl received intelligence summaries from every theater, and by late July 1943, patterns emerged that troubled him more than frontline setbacks.
Romania, Germany's primary source of natural crude oil, reported disturbing trends. The Ploești refinery complex, sprawling across 30 square miles, 35 miles north of Bucharest, processed virtually all of Romania's oil production. 13 major refineries, Astra Română, Concordia Vega, Standard Petrol Bloc, Columbia Aquila, Credito Minier, Unirea Orion, Dacia Romana, Redevența, Steaua Romana, and 4 smaller facilities could process 8 million tons of crude annually. These refineries supplied 60% of Germany's crude oil imports. Without Romanian oil, the Wehrmacht couldn't function. Synthetic fuel plants in the Ruhr and Silesia produced gasoline from coal, but synthetic production couldn't replace Romanian crude for diesel, lubricants, and aviation fuel. Jodl's intelligence summary from July 28, 1943, noted, Romanian refinery outputs declining month over month. April production, 720,000 tons. May production, 680,000 tons. June production, 630,000 tons. Romanian officials attribute decline to equipment wear, maintenance delays, and worker shortages. German technical inspectors find facilities operating within normal parameters. Cause of production decline remains unexplained. What made this particularly ominous was the absence of obvious culprits. No partisan attacks had targeted the refineries. Romanian security forces guarded the facilities carefully. Oil was Romania's most valuable strategic asset, and the government understood its importance to Germany. Allied strategic bombing hadn't yet reached Romania. The refineries lay 1,200 miles from the nearest British airfields, far beyond the range of RAF heavy bombers. Yet production declined steadily, inexplicably, like a patient bleeding internally from an unseen wound. The truth that German commanders didn't yet grasp was that American strategic planners had spent the previous 18 months identifying Germany's single greatest vulnerability. And they had concluded that Germany's Achilles heel wasn't steel production, weapons manufacturing, or or even manpower. It was oil. In Washington, D.C., a collection of military officers and civilian experts had been waging a different kind of war. The Committee of Operations Analysts, or COA, formed in November 1942, consisted of strategic planners, industry specialists, and intelligence analysts, tasked with answering one question: where should Allied bombers strike to most effectively cripple Germany's war-making capacity? The committee included men like Elihu Root Jr., a prominent New York attorney, Fowler Hamilton, an expert in organization, and Dr. Edward Meade Earle, a military historian from Princeton. But the man who had proved most influential was Colonel Richard D. Oily Hughes, a Texas oil executive commissioned into the Air Forces. Hughes brought to the committee something German planners lacked: intimate understanding of oil industry vulnerabilities. Before the war, he had managed refinery operations and understood the complex processes that transformed crude oil into usable fuel. More importantly, he understood bottlenecks, the specific points where disrupting production would cascade through entire systems. In February 1943, Hughes presented his analysis to the COA. His conclusions would reshape Allied strategic bombing doctrine and ultimately doom the Third Reich. "Gentlemen," Hughes began, spreading maps and production charts across the conference cable, "Germany has built an impressive industrial base. Their steel production exceeds Britain's. Their aircraft factories can replace losses faster than we can inflict them. Their ammunition plants operate at full capacity. In virtually every category of war production, Germany appears formidable, even unstoppable." He paused, letting the grim assessment sink in before continuing. "But there is one resource Germany cannot manufacture in sufficient quantity, cannot replace when destroyed, and cannot wage war without: oil." The numbers Hughes presented told a story of existential vulnerability. Germany entered the war in September 1939 with access to approximately 2.4 million tons of oil annually, barely sufficient for peacetime economic activity, wholly inadequate for military operations. The conquest of Poland and France added nothing. Neither nation possessed significant oil resources. Then came the Balkan Campaign of 1941. Germany's primary motivation for invading Yugoslavia and supporting the conquest of Romania wasn't territorial expansion or ideological crusade. It was oil. Romania's Prahova Valley oil fields, centered around the city of Ploești, produced approximately 5.5 million barrels annually, roughly 8 million tons when refined. This single source now provided nearly 60% of Germany's natural crude oil. Without it, the Wehrmacht would grind to a halt within months. But even Romanian oil wasn't enough. Hughes's analysis showed that Germany's military consumed approximately 1.8 million tons of fuel monthly, 21.6 million tons annually. Romania supplied 8 million. German synthetic fuel plants, which produced gasoline from coal using the Fischer-Tropsch process, added another 5.5 million tons. Total available, 13.5 million tons annually. The mathematics were inescapable. Germany consumed fuel 60% faster than it could be produced. The deficit of 8 million tons annually was being covered by strategic reserves built up before the war. Reserves that would be exhausted by late 1944, even without Allied intervention.
But there's more, Hughes continued. These production figures assume no losses, no disruption, perfect efficiency. In reality, Germany loses approximately 15% of production to transportation accidents, storage losses, and system inefficiency. This reduces available fuel to roughly 11.5 million tons annually. He circled a figure on the chart, deficit of 10 million tons annually. Germany is already on borrowed time, Hughes concluded. They're burning through pre-war strategic reserves at an unsustainable rate. If we can disrupt oil production, particularly Romanian crude, we don't just inconvenience their military operations, we end them. The COA's recommendation forwarded to the Joint Chiefs of Staff in March 1943 was unambiguous. Prioritize oil targets above all others.
But recommending oil strikes and executing them were vastly different challenges. Germany's oil infrastructure was scattered across occupied Europe. Synthetic fuel plants dotted the Ruhr Valley in Silesia, protected by the densest anti-aircraft defenses on Earth. Romanian refineries lay 1,200 miles from Allied airfields in North Africa at the extreme range of heavy bombers. Conventional strategic bombing doctrine, high-altitude area attacks, couldn't guarantee the precision needed to destroy specific refinery components. Then, Lieutenant Colonel Jacob Edward Smart proposed an idea so audacious it bordered on suicide: low-level attack. Smart, a 33-year-old operations officer on General Henry Hap Arnold's staff, had studied British commando raids and concluded that air power could employ similar tactics. Instead of bombing from 20,000 feet, send heavy bombers in at minimum altitude, treetop level, to strike with surgical precision. The concept violated every principle of strategic bomber operations. B-24 Liberators were designed to operate at 25,000 feet, where thin air and altitude provided some protection from anti-aircraft fire and fighters. Smart proposed sending them in at 200 to 300 feet, where every rifle, machine gun and light flak battery could reach them. But low-level attack offered revolutionary advantages. At 200 feet, bombardiers could see their targets with perfect clarity. Accuracy would increase tenfold. A well-placed bomb could destroy critical refinery infrastructure that high-altitude raids might miss entirely. And perhaps most importantly, attacking at dawn from unexpected directions could achieve complete surprise, hitting targets before defenses could respond effectively. General Arnold, commander of the US Army Air Forces, reviewed Smart's proposal with characteristic bluntness. "This will cost us. The losses will be severe. But if Hughes is right about oil being Germany's vulnerability, those losses will be worth paying." Arnold approved planning for what would become Operation Tidal Wave, a massive low-level raid against Ploești's refineries. The target selection reflected ruthless calculation. Ploești wasn't just Romania's oil hub, it was Nazi Germany's fuel tank. The refineries processed crude oil from the Prahova Valley fields through an intricate series of industrial processes. Crude oil, straight from the ground, was useless for military purposes. It was too thick, too impure, and burned inefficiently. Refineries transformed it through cracking towers that broke heavy molecules into lighter ones, reformers that increased octane ratings for aviation fuel, and fractioning columns that separated crude into gasoline, diesel, kerosene, and lubricants. Destroy the refineries, and Romania's oil fields became strategically worthless. Crude oil couldn't power Panzer engines or fuel Luftwaffe fighters. Germany would lose 60% of its oil supply overnight. The operational planning for Tidal Wave began in earnest in May 1943. Every detail mattered because margin for error simply didn't exist in a mission this ambitious and dangerous. The consolidated B-24 Liberator was chosen for Operation Tidal Wave for specific technical reasons that made it uniquely suited, or at least less unsuited, for this suicide mission profile. The B-24's combat radius of approximately 2,100 miles could barely reach Ploești from Allied airfields around Benghazi, Libya, and return, barely. The distance was 1,200 miles each way, leaving minimal fuel margin for combat maneuvering, mechanical problems, or navigational errors. Pilots would cross the Mediterranean, fly over German-occupied Greece and Bulgaria, strike the target, and return along the same route. Any significant deviation would leave them swimming in the Mediterranean or crash landing in enemy territory. The aircraft's 4 Pratt & Whitney R1830 radial engines, each producing 1,200 horsepower, provided crucial redundancy. Losing one engine wouldn't necessarily doom the mission. The B-24 could fly on 3 engines, though with reduced speed and altitude capability. This redundancy would prove life-saving for dozens of crews on August 1st. The B-24's bomb load capacity of 8,000 pounds, carried in 2 internal bomb bays, would deliver precisely what refineries feared most: 1,000-pound delayed action demolition bombs and 500-pound incendiaries. The delayed action bombs were particularly insidious. They would penetrate deep into refinery structures, cracking towers, reformers, boiler houses, before exploding seconds or minutes later, destroying internal machinery that external blasts might leave intact. And perhaps most importantly, attacking at dawn from unexpected directions could achieve complete surprise, hitting targets before defenses could respond effectively.
The incendiaries would ignite the thousands of barrels of refined fuel stored at each facility, creating firestorms that would spread through the entire complex. Planning fell to Colonel Jacob Smart and his team at Air Force's headquarters. They worked with extraordinary intelligence support from British MI6 and the American Office of Strategic Services, OSS. Agents in Romania, partisans, and aerial reconnaissance provided detailed information about Ploești's defenses and layout. What emerged was an intelligence picture of almost photographic precision. Smart's planners knew not just where each refinery was located, but which buildings housed what equipment. They identified the boiler houses that generated steam for the cracking process, the reforming units that boosted octane ratings for aviation fuel, the storage tanks holding finished products. This level of detail allowed for surgical target assignment. Each of the 5 participating bomb groups would attack specific refineries with specific aim points. Destroy the boiler house at Astra Română, and the entire facility loses power. Hit the reforming towers at Concordia Lega, and aviation fuel production stops even if crude processing continues. Ignite the storage tanks at Columbia Aquila, and finished fuel that took weeks to refine burns in hours. 177 B-24 Liberators from 5 bomb groups would participate. The 98th Bombardment Group, Heavy, Pyramiders, the 44th BG, Flying 8 Balls, the 93rd BG, Ted's Traveling Circus, the 389th BG, Sky Scorpions, and the 376th BG, Liberandos. Each group consisted of 28 to 36 aircraft, with 10-man crews: pilot, co-pilot, navigator, bombardier, flight engineer, radio operator, and 4 gunners. The mission profile was unprecedented in its ambition and risk. Aircraft would take off from desert airstrips around Benghazi before dawn, form up over the Mediterranean, and fly north across Axis-occupied territory at altitudes between 50 and 300 feet, low enough to avoid German radar, high enough to avoid terrain obstacles. At 300 feet altitude, B-24s would be invisible to German radar stations designed to detect high-altitude bomber formations, but they would be exposed to every form of ground fire. At that height, rifle bullets could penetrate the thin aluminum skin of the aircraft. Machine guns would find easy targets. Even light anti-aircraft weapons, normally ineffective against high-altitude bombers, would be deadly. The flight path itself was an elaborate deception. Instead of approaching Ploești from the south, the direct route from Libya, the formations would fly north across the Mediterranean, turn east over Albania, cross Yugoslavia and western Romania, then turn south to attack Ploești from the north. This roundabout approach of over 2,400 miles added hours to the mission, but offered crucial advantages. Attacking from the north placed the sun behind the American aircraft, forcing German and Romanian defenders to look into intense glare when trying to aim anti-aircraft weapons. The northern approach also meant attacking across lower ground before the refineries, giving bombardiers better visual acquisition of targets. And perhaps most importantly, German intelligence anticipated attacks from the south, the logical approach from Allied bases. Coming from the opposite direction might provide precious seconds of additional surprise. Training for tidal wave consumed 8 weeks. In the Libyan desert, American engineers and Romanian defectors constructed a full-scale mock-up of Ploești, using rocks, sand, and whatever materials were available. Pilots flew practice missions over this mock-up until they could navigate to their assigned targets without instruments. crews studied thousands of reconnaissance photographs until they could identify each refinery from ground level. They memorized the layout of roads, rail lines, distinctive buildings, any landmark that might aid navigation when flying at treetop height at 200 miles per hour. Lieutenant Colonel Addison Baker reportedly told his crews during a briefing, "We're going to fly this mission so low that Romanian farmers will be looking down at us from their fields. We'll have approximately 30 seconds over target to identify our aim point, line up the approach, drop our bombs, and get out. Miss your target, and you'll hit your wingman's target behind you. Hesitate for 5 seconds, and you'll fly into your own bomb blast." The bomb loads were carefully calculated for maximum refinery damage. Each B-24 carried a mix of weapons: 1,000-pound AN-M65 general-purpose bombs with delayed action fuses, 500 pounds AN-M64 general-purpose bombs, and 100 pounds AN-M47 incendiary clusters. The delayed action fuses were set for 1 to 45-second delays. This allowed bombs to penetrate deep into structures before exploding. A bomb hitting a cracking tower would crash through multiple levels of equipment before detonating inside the structure, destroying machinery that would be difficult or impossible to replace. The incendiaries would do the rest. Refineries are inherently vulnerable to fire. They process highly flammable hydrocarbons in volatile chemical processes. Once ignited, refinery fires are nearly impossible to extinguish quickly because fuel continues feeding the flames from ruptured pipes and storage tanks. As July turned to August, final preparations accelerated. Crews wrote letters home, many would be mailed posthumously. Chaplains conducted services. Intelligence officers provided last-minute updates on German fighter strength and anti-aircraft positions. On the evening of July 31, 1943, mission commanders gathered for final briefings. The weather forecast was acceptable. Clear skies over Romania, critical for visual navigation and bombing. German fighter strength in Romania appeared manageable, perhaps 40 Romanian and German fighters based near Ploești, not enough to stop 177 heavily armed bombers if the formation stayed tight.
British. What worried planners most was anti-aircraft defenses. Intelligence indicated Ploești was heavily protected with over 200 heavy flat guns, 88mm and 105mm weapons that could reach 30,000 feet with deadly accuracy. But these weapons were positioned to defend against high-altitude attack. At low level, they'd be less effective, unable to depress their barrels far enough to track fast-moving targets below 1,000 feet. Light anti-aircraft weapons posed a different threat. Romanian and German forces had positioned hundreds of 20mm and 37mm automatic cannons around the refineries. These rapid-fire weapons could track low-altitude targets and throw up devastating curtains of fire. Add in hundreds of machine gun positions and thousands of troops with rifles, and the low-level approach would expose bombers to a gauntlet of fire. But the potential payoff justified the risk. As Colonel Smart told assembled crews on the evening before the mission, "We're going to lose aircraft tomorrow. We're going to lose crews. But if we succeed, we'll strike a blow that will shorten this war by months, maybe years. Germany runs on oil, and tomorrow we're going to drain their tank." At 0400 hours on August 1, 1943, the first B-24s began rolling down desert runways around Benghazi. In the pre-dawn darkness, 178 Liberators, one more than planned due to a last-minute spare joining the formation, took off in sequence, formed up over the Mediterranean, and turned north toward enemy territory. The formation represented approximately 1,800 American airmen, pilots, navigators, bombardiers, gunners, all volunteers who understood they were flying into one of the most dangerous missions of the war. Many were 20 years old or younger. Most had never seen combat before arriving in North Africa. All knew that casualties would be heavy. The flight across the Mediterranean passed without incident.
Below, the dark water gave way to the Albanian coast as the formation crossed from sea to land. Navigator Lieutenant Harold Wick. The fires at Ploești burned for 3 days. What German engineers didn't realize was that Operation Tidal Wave had exposed a fatal vulnerability that Allied commanders would exploit relentlessly for the next 2 years. Within weeks, the effects cascaded through Germany's military. At Ploești, American bombs had destroyed irreplaceable machinery deep inside refinery structures. The Astra Română cracking tower lay in ruins. The Columbia Aquila storage tanks burned 400,000 barrels of refined fuel. By September 1943, Ploești's output dropped from 8 million tons annually to 3.2 million, a 60% reduction that eliminated Germany's strategic oil reserves overnight. The front lines felt it immediately. General Major Nering's Panzer Corps sat immobilized, 120 operational tanks with no fuel to reach the battlefield. Luftwaffe ace Oberst Steinhoff watched American bombers pass overhead because his squadron lacked fuel to intercept. U-boats returned to port early, their offensive capability evaporating. But Tidal Wave was only the beginning. Throughout 1944, Allied bombers returned again and again. The 15th Air Force flew repeated high-altitude missions against Ploești. The 8th Air Force devastated Germany's synthetic fuel plants, hitting the massive Luna facility 19 times in 6 months. The numbers told the story. Germany's fuel production collapsed from 1.6 million tons monthly in January 1944 to just 260,000 tons by December, an 84% decline. The Wehrmacht still consumed 1.8 million tons monthly. The math was fatal. Hauptmann Klaus von dem Bach, a Tiger tank commander, wrote in his diary, "We have fuel for only 50 kilometers. The distance to Normandy is 280 kilometers. We sit here while our comrades die." Luftwaffe pilots drew lots to determine who could fly. 18 operational aircraft, fuel for only 6. By March 1945, German military units operated on fuel reserves measured in liters rather than tons. Panzer divisions abandoned tanks when they ran dry. The Luftwaffe's sorties dropped 83% from January 1944 levels. The Wehrmacht's surrender came partly because armies had become immobile garrisons. Albert Speer testified at Nuremberg, "The attack on oil was the decisive operation of the war. Once our fuel production was destroyed, everything else became inevitable." The 54 aircraft lost at Ploești on August 1, 1943, had begun the campaign that strangled Nazi Germany. The invisible weapon wasn't new technology. It was the systematic destruction of the fuel every tank, aircraft, and ship required to function. Without oil, Germany's mighty Wehrmacht became immobile. The ships never sailed, the panzers never rolled, the fighters never flew, and the Third Reich, strangled by its dependence on a resource it couldn't protect, collapsed into defeat.